Chapter 1. Understanding the nature of emotions. Emotions are among the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, yet they remain widely misunderstood. Many people believe emotions are spontaneous, uncontrollable reactions that simply happen to them. This belief is one of the main reasons emotions gain control over thoughts, decisions, and actions. To control emotions effectively, one must first understand what emotions are, how they arise, and why they influence behavior so deeply. Emotions are not weaknesses, nor are they enemies of rational thinking. They are biological and psychological signals, designed to help human beings survive, adapt, and interact with the world. Fear alerts us to danger. Anger signals perceived injustice. Sadness reflects loss, and joy reinforces meaningful experiences. Problems arise not because emotions exist, but because individuals respond to them without awareness or regulation. At the most basic level, an emotion is a reaction to interpretation, not to reality itself. Two people can face the same situation and experience entirely different emotional responses. This alone proves that emotions are not dictated by external events, but by how the mind interprets those events. When interpretation happens automatically and unconsciously, emotions appear uncontrollable. When interpretation becomes conscious, emotional control becomes possible. Many individuals confuse emotions with actions. Feeling anger is not the same as acting aggressively. Feeling fear is not the same as avoiding responsibility. Feeling sadness is not the same as giving up. Emotions are internal experiences, while actions are choices. Emotional maturity begins when a person learns to separate what is felt from what is done. This distinction is essential. Without it, emotions dictate behavior. With it, emotions inform behavior without controlling it. Another widespread misunderstanding is the belief that suppressing emotions is the same as controlling them. Suppression involves ignoring, denying, or pushing emotions away. Control involves recognizing emotions, understanding their source, and choosing a measured response. Suppressed emotions do not disappear. They accumulate, intensify, and eventually surface in unhealthy ways such as chronic stress, sudden outbursts, emotional numbness, or physical symptoms. True emotional control requires engagement, not avoidance. Emotions are shaped by past experiences, conditioning, beliefs, and expectations. Early life experiences, cultural norms, and repeated patterns of thinking all influence emotional responses. A person who has learned to associate criticism with rejection may experience intense anger or shame when receiving feedback. Another person with a different internal framework may experience curiosity or motivation instead. Neither reaction is random. Both are learned. Understanding this learned nature of emotional responses is empowering. What has been learned can be unlearned. What has been conditioned can be reconditioned. Emotional control is not about changing personality, but about refining internal responses through awareness and practice. This process takes time, patience, and honesty, but it is achievable for anyone willing to observe themselves without judgment. One of the most critical aspects of emotional understanding is recognizing emotional triggers. A trigger is not the event itself, but the meaning assigned to it. Disrespect, failure, rejection, uncertainty, and loss are common emotional triggers because they threaten identity, security, or self-worth. When a trigger is activated, the emotional response can feel immediate and overwhelming. In reality, there is always a brief gap between stimulus and response. Emotional control is developed by learning to recognize and expand that gap. People often describe emotions as if they take control of the body and mind against one's will. This experience is real, But it does not mean emotions are inherently uncontrollable. These systems evolve to react quickly, not wisely. In modern life, where threats are often psychological rather than physical, these rapid reactions can be inappropriate or harmful. Emotional control does not eliminate these reactions, but it allows higher cognitive processes to intervene before action is taken. Another important principle is that emotions are temporary states, not permanent truths. An emotion can feel absolute and convincing in the moment, but it does not represent the full reality of a situation. Anger narrows perception. Fear exaggerates risk. Sadness highlights loss while ignoring possibility. Emotional control requires the ability to recognize that emotions distort perspective. This recognition alone reduces their power. It is also essential to understand that controlling emotions does not mean becoming emotionally distant or indifferent. Emotional intelligence involves the ability to feel deeply without being destabilized. Emotionally controlled individuals still experience joy, grief, passion, and concern. The difference is that their emotions do not override judgment or values. They remain internally stable even when emotions are intense. Many people delay learning emotional control because they believe it should come naturally. In reality, emotional regulation is a skill, not a trait. Like any skill, it improves with deliberate practice. No one is born with perfect emotional control, and no one is permanently incapable of developing it. The belief that emotional reactions define personality is inaccurate. Emotional patterns reflect habits of thought and response, not fixed identity. This chapter establishes a foundational truth. Emotions are signals, not commands. They provide information about internal states and perceived circumstances, but they do not dictate behavior unless allowed to do so. Emotional control begins when responsibility for reactions is accepted. Blaming emotions for behavior removes personal agency. Taking responsibility restores it. As this book progresses, practical methods will be introduced to strengthen emotional awareness, regulate emotional responses, and build long-term emotional resilience. These methods are not theoretical ideals. They are grounded in psychology, neuroscience, and real-world application. However, none of them can be effective without the understanding developed here. To control emotions, one must first stop fighting them, stop fearing them, and stop identifying with them. Every emotional experience is the result of a precise interaction between the brain, the nervous system, and psychological interpretation. To control emotions effectively, it is essential to understand how emotional reactions are generated at a biological and psychological level. Without this understanding, emotional control remains an attempt to manage symptoms rather than causes. At the center of emotional processing is the brain. While the human brain is highly complex, emotional reactions primarily involve a small number of key structures that operate together. One of the most influential of these structures is the amygdala. The amygdala acts as an emotional alarm system. Its primary function is to detect potential threats and trigger rapid responses to ensure survival. This system evolved long before rational thought became dominant, which explains why emotional reactions often occur before conscious reasoning has time to intervene. When a stimulus is perceived, whether it is a sound, a word, a facial expression, or a memory, the brain processes this information through multiple pathways. One pathway is fast and automatic, leading directly to emotional response. Another pathway is slower and involves higher reasoning centers. The problem arises when the fast pathway dominates, allowing emotion to drive behavior without evaluation. This is commonly experienced as emotional hijacking, where a person reacts impulsively and later regrets the response. The prefrontal cortex plays a critical role in emotional regulation. This area of the brain is responsible for planning, judgment, impulse control, and decision-making. When functioning effectively, it can moderate emotional reactions by analyzing context, consequences, and alternative responses. However, under stress, fatigue, or prolonged emotional pressure, the influence of the prefrontal cortex weakens. In such states, emotional reactions become stronger and harder to regulate. Stress hormones further complicate emotional control. When the brain perceives a threat, the body releases cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals prepare the body for action by increasing heart rate, sharpening focus, and mobilizing energy. While this response is useful in genuine emergencies, it becomes problematic in everyday situations such as arguments, workplace pressure, or social conflict. Elevated stress hormones reduce cognitive flexibility and increase emotional intensity, making calm reasoning difficult. Psychologically, emotions are shaped by interpretation. The brain does not react to events themselves, but to the meaning assigned to them. This meaning is constructed through beliefs, expectations, past experiences, and internal narratives. For example, a critical comment can be interpreted as an attack on competence, a helpful observation, or an irrelevant opinion. Each interpretation produces a different emotional response. Emotional control depends on recognizing and adjusting these interpretations. Memory plays a significant role in emotional reactions. The brain stores emotional memories more vividly than neutral ones. This means past experiences influence present reactions, often without conscious awareness. A person who has experienced betrayal may react with intense suspicion even in situations that do not warrant it. The emotional brain is designed to prevent repeated harm, but it does not distinguish well between past and present. Emotional control involves teaching the brain to update its responses based on current reality rather than past conditioning. Another important factor is attention. Emotions intensify when attention is focused on them. When a person continuously thinks about an upsetting event, the emotional response is repeatedly activated. This creates a feedback loop in which thought strengthens emotion, and emotion reinforces thought. Over time, this loop becomes habitual. Breaking this cycle requires learning to shift attention deliberately rather than allowing it to remain fixed on emotionally charged content. The nervous system also influences emotional stability. Individuals with a chronically overstimulated nervous system are more prone to emotional reactivity. Poor sleep, excessive caffeine, lack of physical activity, and constant digital stimulation all contribute to heightened emotional sensitivity. Personality traits and temperament influence emotional tendencies, but they do not eliminate the capacity for control. Some individuals are naturally more emotionally reactive, while others are more reserved. These differences reflect baseline sensitivity, not fixed outcomes. Emotional regulation skills can be developed regardless of temperament. Understanding one's emotional baseline allows for more realistic expectations and more effective strategies. It is also important to address the role of self-talk in emotional reactions. Internal dialogue shapes emotional experience continuously. Negative, absolute, or catastrophic self-talk amplifies emotional distress. Statements such as "this always happens," "I am not respected," or "I cannot handle this," reinforce emotional reactions and reduce perceived control. The mind and body operate as an integrated system. Emotional reactions involve physical sensations such as muscle tension, changes in breathing, and shifts in posture. These physical responses feed back into emotional experience. Rapid breathing can increase anxiety, while relaxed posture can reduce emotional intensity. Emotional control therefore includes awareness of physical states and the ability to regulate them intentionally. Another psychological component of emotional reactions is identity attachment. Emotions become more intense when a situation threatens how a person sees themselves. Challenges to competence, morality, status, or belonging often trigger strong emotional responses. The stronger the attachment to a particular identity, the stronger the emotional reaction when that identity is challenged. Emotional control does not require abandoning identity, but it does require flexibility in how identity is held. Understanding emotional reactions also involves recognizing that emotions seek expression. When emotions are consistently ignored or invalidated, they tend to resurface with greater force. This does not mean emotions must be expressed impulsively. It means they must be acknowledged internally. Acknowledgement reduces intensity by signaling to the brain that the information has been received. Over time, repeated emotional patterns become automatic. The brain is efficient and favors familiar responses. This efficiency can work against emotional control if habitual reactions are unhelpful. However, the same mechanism allows for positive change. With consistent practice, new emotional responses can become automatic. This is the biological basis of emotional training. Effective control begins earlier at the level of perception, interpretation, and physiological regulation. By the time an emotion has reached peak intensity, options are limited. The goal is not to eliminate emotional responses, but to intervene before they dominate behavior. This chapter establishes a critical understanding. Emotional reactions are not random, uncontrollable forces. They are the result of identifiable biological processes and psychological interpretations. When these processes are understood, they can be influenced. Emotional mastery is not achieved through willpower alone, but through knowledge, awareness, and consistent practice. As the foundation deepens, the next chapter will focus on developing emotional awareness. Awareness is the bridge between understanding emotions and controlling them. Without awareness, knowledge remains theoretical. With awareness, emotional control becomes practical and sustainable. Chapter 3. Developing emotional awareness. Most individuals spend the majority of their mental energy focused outward, reacting to situations, people, and outcomes. As a result, emotional reactions often occur unnoticed until they become intense. By the time an emotion is clearly recognized, it may already be influencing speech, posture, tone, and decision-making. One of the first steps in developing emotional awareness is learning to identify emotions accurately. Many people describe their emotional state using vague terms such as stressed, upset, or fine. These labels lack precision and limit understanding. Stress can include fear, frustration, pressure, or uncertainty. Being upset can involve anger, disappointment, shame, or sadness. Accurate identification reduces emotional confusion and allows for appropriate regulation. Naming emotions has a measurable effect on emotional intensity. When an emotion is clearly labeled, the brain shifts activity toward regions involved in language and reasoning. This shift reduces activation in emotional centers and creates psychological distance. Emotional awareness, therefore, involves developing a vocabulary for emotional experience and using it consistently. The goal is not to analyze emotions excessively, but to recognize them clearly. Emotions rarely occur in isolation. They tend to follow familiar sequences triggered by specific situations. For example, criticism may trigger defensiveness, which leads to anger, followed by withdrawal. Awareness involves noticing these patterns over time, rather than focusing on individual incidents. Once patterns are recognized, emotional reactions become more predictable and manageable. Emotional awareness also includes sensitivity to physical signals. Emotions manifest in the body before they are fully conscious in the mind. Tightness in the chest, shallow breathing, jaw tension, or increased heart rate often appear before emotional escalation. These physical sensations act as early warning signs. Individuals who learn to notice these signals gain an opportunity to regulate emotions before they intensify. Many people avoid emotional awareness because it feels uncomfortable. Observing emotions can initially increase discomfort, especially when emotions are associated with vulnerability or past experiences. However, avoidance increases long-term emotional instability. Awareness reduces emotional power over time. Emotions that are observed tend to pass more quickly and with less disruption than emotions that are resisted or ignored. Judgment is a major obstacle to emotional awareness. When emotions are labeled as bad, weak, or unacceptable, awareness becomes distorted. Individuals may suppress or deny emotions to protect self-image. Emotional awareness requires a neutral stance. Emotions are neither good nor bad. They are information. Accepting this perspective allows emotions to be observed without resistance or exaggeration. Another challenge to emotional awareness is identification with emotion. When individuals say, "I am angry," rather than "I feel anger," they merge identity with emotional state. This identification increases emotional intensity and reduces perceived control. This shift in language and perception creates space for regulation. Attention training is a practical method for strengthening emotional awareness. Regularly pausing to check internal state builds the habit of observation. This does not require extended reflection. Brief moments of awareness throughout the day are sufficient. Over time, this practice increases sensitivity to emotional changes and reduces reactivity. Emotional awareness also involves understanding emotional triggers. A trigger is not simply an external event, but the internal meaning attached to it. Awareness involves noticing not only what triggered an emotion, but why it triggered it. This requires honesty and self-examination. Common triggers often relate to self-worth, control, fairness, or belonging. Recognizing these underlying themes provides insight into emotional vulnerabilities. It is important to recognize that emotional awareness does not eliminate emotional responses. Its purpose is to create choice. Without awareness, emotions dictate reactions automatically. With awareness, individuals can decide how to respond. This distinction is fundamental to emotional control. Awareness precedes regulation. One cannot regulate what one does not recognize. Over time, emotional awareness becomes less effortful. Initially, it requires conscious attention. With practice, it becomes an automatic aspect of perception. Emotionally aware individuals notice subtle shifts in mood and energy and adjust accordingly. This prevents emotional buildup and reduces the likelihood of extreme reactions. Emotional awareness also improves empathy and communication. Individuals who understand their own emotions are better able to recognize emotions in others. This enhances interpersonal interactions and reduces conflict. Awareness allows individuals to respond to emotional situations with understanding rather than defensiveness. A common misconception is that emotional awareness leads to overthinking or emotional indulgence. In reality, awareness reduces rumination by clarifying emotional experience. When emotions are clearly recognized, the mind is less likely to replay events repeatedly in an attempt to understand them. Awareness brings resolution rather than fixation. As emotional awareness strengthens, individuals begin to notice the transient nature of emotions. Emotions rise, peak, and fall when allowed to move naturally. This observation reduces fear of emotion and increases confidence in one's ability to remain stable during emotional experiences. This chapter establishes emotional awareness as the foundation of emotional mastery. Awareness transforms emotional experience from an uncontrollable force into observable information. It creates the space necessary for regulation, choice, and growth. The next chapter will focus on self-regulation. While awareness allows emotions to be recognized, regulation provides the tools to guide emotional responses constructively and effectively. Awareness allows emotions to be recognized, but self-regulation determines how those emotions are managed. Self-regulation is the ability to influence emotional responses intentionally rather than reacting impulsively. It is not a suppression of emotion, nor is it an attempt to eliminate emotional experience. It is the disciplined process of guiding emotional energy in a constructive direction. Self-regulation begins with the pause. Between an emotional trigger and a behavioral response, there is always a brief moment of choice. This moment is often overlooked because emotional reactions feel immediate. However, it exists in every situation. Emotional discipline is developed by learning to notice this pause and expand it. Even a few seconds of delay can prevent an impulsive response and allow reason to re-enter the process. Breathing plays a central role in emotional regulation. Emotional reactions are closely tied to breathing patterns. Anxiety and anger are often accompanied by shallow, rapid breathing, while calm states are associated with slower, deeper breaths. By consciously adjusting breathing, individuals can influence the nervous system directly. Controlled breathing sends a signal of safety to the brain, reducing emotional intensity and restoring cognitive balance. Another essential self-regulation skill is emotional reframing. Reframing involves consciously adjusting the interpretation of a situation. Since emotions arise from meaning, changing meaning alters emotional response. This does not require denial of reality, but rather a broader and more accurate perspective. Viewing a challenge as an opportunity for learning rather than a personal failure reduces emotional distress and increases resilience. Physical posture and movement also affect emotional states. Slumped posture, clenched muscles, and restricted movement reinforce emotional tension. Upright posture and relaxed movement support emotional stability. Simple physical adjustments can reduce emotional intensity and improve self-control. Emotional discipline includes awareness of how the body influences the mind. Impulse control is another critical component of self-regulation. Emotional impulses often urge immediate action, such as speaking defensively, withdrawing, or confronting aggressively. Acting on these impulses may provide short-term relief, but often leads to long-term consequences. Self-regulation involves tolerating temporary discomfort in order to act in alignment with values and long-term goals. Delayed response is a practical technique for emotional discipline. When emotions are strong, postponing action allows intensity to decrease. Writing rather than speaking, waiting before responding to messages, or taking a short break are simple strategies that prevent emotional escalation. Time is a powerful regulator. Most emotions lose intensity when given space. Self-regulation also involves setting internal boundaries. Not every emotional reaction deserves attention or action. Learning to choose which emotions to engage with and which to let pass is a sign of emotional maturity. This choice requires discernment rather than avoidance. It involves asking whether acting on a particular emotion will be constructive or harmful. Emotional control is not achieved through occasional effort, but through repeated practice. Small daily acts of regulation build long-term emotional strength. Over time, regulated responses become habitual, reducing the effort required to maintain emotional balance. Self-regulation is strengthened by alignment with personal values. When individuals are clear about what matters to them, emotional decisions become easier. Values provide a stable reference point during emotional turbulence. Instead of reacting based on feeling alone, individuals can respond based on principle. This alignment increases self-respect and reduces emotional regret. Emotional discipline does not mean emotional rigidity. Flexibility is essential. Different situations require different emotional responses. The goal is not to remain emotionally neutral at all times, but to respond appropriately. Emotional control allows emotions to be expressed constructively rather than destructively. One of the most challenging aspects of self-regulation is managing emotions in interpersonal situations. Emotional reactions are often amplified in the presence of others due to social dynamics, expectations, and perceived judgment. Emotional discipline in relationships requires patience, listening, and restraint. Responding calmly under emotional pressure builds trust and credibility. Fatigue significantly weakens self-regulation. When physical or mental energy is depleted, emotional control becomes more difficult. This highlights the importance of rest, nutrition, and recovery in emotional discipline. Emotional strength is supported by physical well-being. Ignoring this connection undermines self-regulation efforts. Another factor influencing emotional discipline is internal dialogue. Self-talk can either support or sabotage regulation. Statements that emphasize control, choice, and perspective strengthen emotional discipline. Statements that reinforce helplessness or victimhood weaken it. Cultivating constructive internal dialogue is a key component of emotional mastery. Emotional discipline also involves forgiveness, both toward oneself and others. Holding on to resentment or self-criticism perpetuates emotional tension. Letting go does not mean excusing behavior or denying accountability. It means releasing emotional attachment that no longer serves a purpose. Forgiveness reduces emotional burden and restores internal balance. Over time, consistent self-regulation leads to emotional confidence. Individuals begin to trust their ability to handle emotional situations without losing control. This confidence reduces fear of emotional experience and increases willingness to engage fully in life. Emotional control becomes a source of strength rather than restriction. This chapter emphasizes that emotional discipline is a skill developed through awareness, practice, and patience. It requires effort initially, but becomes increasingly natural with repetition. Emotional mastery is not achieved through force, but through understanding and disciplined response. Chapter 5. Understanding and Controlling Anger. It is often labeled as dangerous, negative, or destructive, yet anger itself is neither good nor bad. Like all emotions, anger is a signal. It indicates that something is perceived as wrong, unjust, threatening, or obstructive. Problems arise not from the presence of anger, but from how it is expressed, suppressed, or allowed to dominate behavior. Emotional control requires a clear and mature understanding of anger and the discipline to respond to it wisely. Anger typically emerges when expectations are violated. These expectations may involve respect, fairness, control, or outcomes. When reality conflicts with internal expectations, anger arises as a response to perceived loss of control or injustice. This response is deeply rooted in survival mechanisms. Historically, anger prepared individuals to defend themselves or correct threats. In modern life, however, the same intensity is often triggered by psychological challenges rather than physical danger. Many people fear their anger because they associate it with loss of control. Others rely on anger as a source of strength or authority. Both perspectives are incomplete. Anger can provide energy, clarity, and motivation, but when unmanaged, it narrows perception and impairs judgment. One of the most important steps in controlling anger is recognizing early signs. Anger rarely appears suddenly at full intensity. It builds gradually through physical and mental signals. Increased muscle tension, changes in breathing, irritability, and repetitive thoughts often precede overt anger. Awareness of these early indicators creates an opportunity for regulation before escalation occurs. Anger is often reinforced by internal narratives. Thoughts such as being disrespected, treated unfairly, or deliberately challenged intensify emotional reaction. These narratives are rarely examined in the moment. Emotional control requires questioning the accuracy and usefulness of these interpretations. This does not mean denying wrongdoing, but it does involve recognizing that perception may be incomplete or distorted by emotion. A common mistake in managing anger is suppression. Suppressed anger does not disappear. It accumulates and often emerges later as resentment, passive aggression, or sudden emotional outbursts. Long-term suppression can also contribute to chronic stress and health issues. Controlling anger means allowing it to be acknowledged internally without allowing it to dictate behavior externally. Another mistake is impulsive expression. Venting anger through aggression, harsh language, or confrontation may provide temporary relief, but it often damages relationships and reinforces emotional reactivity. Repeated impulsive expression trains the brain to associate anger with immediate action, making future regulation more difficult. Emotional discipline requires resisting the urge for immediate release in favor of measured response. Time plays a crucial role in anger regulation. Anger is one of the fastest escalating emotions, but it is also one of the fastest to decline when not fueled by continued rumination. Allowing time to pass before responding reduces intensity and restores perspective. Delaying action is not avoidance. It is strategic self-control. Physical regulation is particularly effective in managing anger. Because anger activates the body for action, releasing physical tension helps reduce emotional intensity. Slow breathing, deliberate movement, and grounding attention in physical sensation signal the nervous system to deactivate threat response. These techniques do not eliminate the cause of anger, but they restore internal stability necessary for rational response. Another important aspect of anger control is responsibility. While external events may trigger anger, responsibility for response always remains internal. Blaming others for one's anger reinforces helplessness and reduces control. Taking responsibility does not mean accepting mistreatment. It means recognizing that emotional response is a personal process that can be guided intentionally. Anger is often linked to unmet needs. These needs may include respect, security, autonomy, or recognition. Understanding what need is threatened provides clarity and direction. When anger is understood at this level, responses become more constructive. Instead of reacting defensively, individuals can address the underlying issue directly and calmly. Communication plays a critical role in anger management. Expressing concerns clearly and respectfully reduces emotional buildup. This requires separating emotion from message. Speaking from a position of clarity rather than intensity increases the likelihood of being heard and respected. Emotional control enhances communication effectiveness rather than suppressing it. Self-respect is closely tied to anger control. Individuals who manage anger effectively demonstrate confidence and emotional maturity. They are less reactive to provocation because their sense of worth is stable. This stability reduces the need to defend ego or assert dominance through anger. Emotional control strengthens presence and credibility. Chronic anger often reflects deeper patterns such as perfectionism, rigid expectations, or unresolved past experiences. Addressing anger at the surface level without examining these patterns limits progress. Emotional mastery involves honest reflection on recurring emotional triggers and the beliefs that sustain them. Change requires willingness to question long-held assumptions. Forgiveness is frequently misunderstood in the context of anger. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, excusing, or reconciling. It means releasing emotional attachment to resentment. Holding on to anger does not punish the source. It burdens the individual experiencing it. Forgiveness restores emotional freedom and reduces internal conflict. It is also important to distinguish between anger and assertiveness. Assertiveness involves expressing needs and boundaries clearly and respectfully. Anger often arises when assertiveness is lacking. Learning to assert oneself early and calmly prevents anger from accumulating. Emotional control includes developing assertive communication skills. Anger management is not about becoming passive or tolerant of harmful behavior. It is about choosing responses that protect dignity, values, and well-being without unnecessary emotional damage. Controlled anger can motivate positive change when guided by clarity and discipline. Over time, consistent anger regulation reshapes emotional habits. Situations that once triggered intense reactions begin to lose their power. This does not happen through force, but through understanding and repetition. Emotional strength grows as confidence in one's ability to remain composed increases. Anger also provides an opportunity for self-knowledge. It reveals boundaries, values, and vulnerabilities. When examined thoughtfully, anger becomes a guide rather than a threat. Emotional mastery involves transforming anger from a disruptive force into a source of insight and growth. This chapter emphasizes that anger is not an enemy to be defeated, but a signal to be understood. When approached with awareness, responsibility, and discipline, anger loses its destructive potential. It becomes manageable, informative, and temporary. Unlike fear, which responds to immediate danger, anxiety focuses on what might happen. It is concerned with uncertainty, potential loss, and imagined outcomes. While anxiety can serve a protective function by encouraging preparation and caution, it becomes harmful when it dominates attention and disrupts emotional balance. Emotional control requires understanding how anxiety develops and how overthinking sustains it. Anxiety begins with uncertainty. The human mind seeks predictability and control. When outcomes are unclear, the brain attempts to fill the gap by imagining possibilities. This process is not inherently negative. However, anxious thinking tends to focus disproportionately on negative outcomes. The mind repeatedly simulates potential threats in an attempt to prevent them. This repeated simulation activates emotional and physiological stress responses as if the threat were real. Overthinking is the mental behavior that sustains anxiety. It involves repetitive analysis without resolution. Rather than leading to clarity, overthinking increases confusion and emotional strain. The mind loops through the same concerns, questions, and imagined scenarios, creating the illusion of problem-solving while actually reinforcing distress. Physiologically, anxiety activates the same stress systems involved in immediate threat response. Elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension, and heightened alertness prepare the body for action. When anxiety is chronic, these systems remain activated for extended periods. This state of prolonged arousal exhausts mental and physical resources, reducing resilience and increasing emotional sensitivity. One of the most effective ways to manage anxiety is by distinguishing between what can be controlled and what cannot. Anxiety thrives when attention is focused on factors beyond personal influence. Emotional discipline involves redirecting attention toward actions that are within control. This shift reduces helplessness and restores a sense of agency. It does not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduces its emotional impact. Another critical factor in anxiety management is tolerance of uncertainty. Many anxious individuals attempt to eliminate uncertainty entirely, which is not possible. Life inherently involves unpredictability. Emotional mastery requires accepting uncertainty as a normal condition rather than a threat. Acceptance does not mean resignation. It means acknowledging reality without excessive resistance. This acceptance reduces mental struggle and emotional tension. Anxious thinking often relies on cognitive distortions. These include catastrophizing, assuming worst-case scenarios, and overestimating personal responsibility for outcomes. Such patterns feel convincing because anxiety heightens emotional intensity. Emotional control involves questioning these thought patterns rather than accepting them automatically. Asking whether a thought is factual, helpful, or necessary reduces its power. Attention management is central to controlling anxiety. Where attention goes, emotional energy follows. Constantly monitoring potential threats maintains anxiety. Deliberately shifting attention to the present moment reduces anticipatory distress. This does not require suppressing thought, but rather anchoring attention in immediate experience. The present moment is rarely as threatening as imagined futures. Breathing and physical regulation are especially important in anxiety management. Slow, controlled breathing directly reduces physiological arousal. Relaxed posture and steady movement reinforce signals of safety. These physical interventions interrupt the feedback loop between anxious thought and bodily tension. Emotional control becomes more accessible when the body is calm. Anxiety is often intensified by avoidance. Avoiding situations that provoke anxiety may provide temporary relief, but it reinforces fear over time. Avoidance signals to the brain that the situation is dangerous. Facing anxiety in manageable steps reduces its intensity and builds confidence. Self-trust is another key component of anxiety regulation. Anxiety often reflects doubt in one's ability to handle potential challenges. Strengthening self-trust involves recognizing past resilience and competence. Emotional control improves when individuals believe they can respond effectively to whatever arises. This belief reduces the perceived need for constant mental rehearsal. Anxiety also feeds on mental fatigue. Excessive information consumption, constant decision-making, and lack of rest overload cognitive systems. When the mind is fatigued, emotional regulation becomes more difficult. Simplifying routines, setting boundaries, and prioritizing rest support. Emotional mastery is supported by mental conservation. Internal dialogue plays a powerful role in anxiety. Reassuring, realistic self-talk reduces emotional intensity. Statements that emphasize capability, perspective, and adaptability counter anxious narratives. Emotional control does not require eliminating anxious thoughts, but it does require refusing to amplify them through negative internal commentary. Anxious thoughts often exaggerate significance and permanence. Situations feel larger and more consequential than they truly are. Emotional discipline involves contextualizing concerns within a broader view of life. This perspective reduces urgency and restores emotional proportion. Anxiety can also be influenced by identity attachment. When outcomes are closely tied to self-worth or personal value, anxiety increases. Emotional mastery involves separating performance from identity. Mistakes, uncertainty, and setbacks do not define worth. This separation reduces emotional pressure and increases flexibility. Over time, consistent anxiety regulation reshapes mental habits. The mind learns that uncertainty is tolerable and manageable. Emotional responses become less intense and less frequent. This change occurs gradually through repeated experience of calm response rather than avoidance. Anxiety is not a flaw or weakness. It is a byproduct of a highly developed mind attempting to anticipate and prepare. When guided by awareness and discipline, this same capacity can be redirected toward constructive planning and creativity. Emotional control transforms anxiety from a source of distress into a signal for focused attention and intentional action. This chapter highlights that anxiety and overthinking are maintained by patterns of attention, interpretation, and avoidance. By addressing these patterns, emotional stability can be restored. Emotional mastery does not require eliminating anxiety, but it does require learning to coexist with uncertainty without surrendering control. Chapter 7: Healthy, Emotional Detachment, and Inner Stability. Attachment creates dependency between emotional well-being and factors beyond personal control. When happiness, peace, or self-worth depend on how others behave or how situations unfold, emotional instability becomes inevitable. Healthy detachment restores emotional independence without eliminating emotional depth. Detachment begins with understanding the difference between involvement and entanglement. Involvement means caring, participating, and contributing. Entanglement means losing emotional balance when expectations are unmet. Emotional control requires remaining involved without becoming emotionally entangled. This balance allows individuals to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. One of the primary sources of emotional distress is personalization. People often interpret events as direct reflections of their value or intent. A delayed response becomes rejection. A disagreement becomes disrespect. A mistake becomes failure. These interpretations intensify emotional reactions. Detachment involves recognizing that many events are influenced by factors unrelated to personal worth. This recognition reduces emotional reactivity and restores perspective. Another important element of emotional detachment is acceptance of limits. No individual can control others' emotions, decisions, or reactions. Attempting to do so creates frustration and resentment. Emotional mastery involves focusing on what can be controlled, such as personal behavior, attitude, and response. Accepting limits does not mean disengagement. It means redirecting energy toward areas of influence. Emotional detachment also involves releasing excessive need for approval. The desire for validation is natural, but dependence on it creates vulnerability. When approval becomes a requirement for self-worth, emotional reactions intensify in response to criticism or indifference. Healthy detachment allows individuals to value feedback without being defined by it. Self-respect becomes internally anchored rather than externally granted. Letting go is a central practice of emotional detachment. Letting go does not mean forgetting or denying experience. It means releasing mental and emotional fixation on events that cannot be changed. Rumination keeps emotional wounds active. Detachment allows experiences to be acknowledged and then mentally released. This process reduces emotional burden and restores clarity. Detachment also applies to emotional states themselves. Many individuals become attached to their emotions, particularly negative ones. They replay feelings of anger, regret, or sadness, believing these emotions are justified or necessary. While emotions may be understandable, holding on to them extends suffering. Emotional control involves allowing emotions to pass without clinging to them. A common fear is that detachment will reduce empathy or compassion. In reality, healthy detachment enhances empathy. When individuals are not overwhelmed by their own emotional reactions, they are better able to understand and respond to others. Detachment reduces defensiveness and increases emotional availability. It allows care without emotional exhaustion. Another misconception is that detachment eliminates motivation. Some believe strong emotions are necessary for ambition and commitment. While emotion can energize action, excessive attachment distorts judgment and increases anxiety. Detachment clarifies motivation by aligning action with values rather than emotional urgency. Purpose becomes steadier and more sustainable. Emotional detachment is particularly valuable in relationships. Interpersonal dynamics often trigger strong emotions due to expectations, history, and vulnerability. Detachment allows individuals to communicate needs and boundaries without emotional escalation. It prevents overreaction to temporary conflict and supports long-term relational stability. Boundaries play a critical role in emotional detachment. Boundaries define where responsibility ends and where another's begins. Without boundaries, individuals absorb others' emotions, problems, and moods. This emotional absorption leads to burnout and resentment. Establishing internal and external boundaries protects emotional energy and supports balance. Detachment also involves flexibility in identity. When individuals strongly identify with roles, opinions, or outcomes, challenges to these identities provoke intense emotional reactions. Emotional mastery requires holding identity with flexibility rather than rigidity. This flexibility allows growth and adaptation without emotional collapse. The practice of detachment is strengthened through observation. Observing thoughts and emotions without immediate reaction creates psychological distance. This distance reduces intensity and increases choice. Observation does not require disengagement from experience. It requires curiosity rather than judgment. Over time, observation becomes a stabilizing habit. Detachment is also supported by perspective. Situations that feel overwhelming in the moment often appear less significant when viewed over time. Emotional control involves remembering the temporary nature of most emotional experiences. This awareness reduces urgency and supports calm response. It is important to distinguish detachment from avoidance. Avoidance involves withdrawing to escape discomfort. Detachment involves remaining present without emotional overwhelm. Avoidance reduces exposure and learning. Detachment increases resilience by allowing engagement without destabilization. Emotional detachment is not achieved instantly. It develops through repeated practice and reflection. Initially, individuals may notice emotional attachment only after reactions occur. With time, awareness increases and responses become more measured. Emotional stability strengthens gradually through consistency rather than force. Detachment also supports self-compassion. When individuals detach from harsh self-judgment, they are able to learn from mistakes without emotional punishment. Self-compassion reduces defensiveness and promotes growth. Emotional control includes treating oneself with fairness and understanding. Another benefit of emotional detachment is clarity in decision-making. Strong emotional attachment narrows focus and distorts evaluation. Detachment restores objectivity, allowing decisions to be guided by reason and values. This clarity improves both personal and professional outcomes. In high-pressure environments, emotional detachment becomes a critical leadership skill. Leaders who remain emotionally balanced under stress inspire confidence and trust. They respond to challenges with calm authority rather than emotional volatility. Emotional control enhances influence and credibility. Detachment also improves emotional recovery. Difficult experiences are inevitable. Emotional mastery is demonstrated not by avoiding difficulty, but by recovering efficiently. Detachment reduces the duration of emotional distress and prevents prolonged rumination. Recovery becomes faster and less disruptive. Ultimately, emotional detachment creates inner freedom. When emotions are experienced without domination, individuals are less reactive and more intentional. Inner stability allows engagement with life from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. Emotional control becomes a natural expression of self-respect and discipline. This chapter establishes emotional detachment as a tool for stability rather than distance. It allows care without exhaustion, involvement without entanglement, and emotion without loss of control. Emotional mastery is not about becoming less human. It is about becoming internally free. Chapter 8. Emotional control in relationships. Relationships are one of the most powerful triggers of emotion. Unlike isolated situations, relationships involve expectations, history, vulnerability, and emotional investment. Because of this, emotional reactions in relationships often feel more intense and personal. Emotional control within relationships does not mean suppressing feelings or avoiding conflict. It means engaging with others in a way that preserves dignity, clarity, and mutual respect. These expectations may involve attention, loyalty, understanding, or behavior. When expectations are not communicated clearly or are unrealistic, disappointment and resentment build. Emotional mastery begins with recognizing that expectations influence emotional response more than behavior itself. Managing expectations reduces emotional volatility. Communication plays a central role in emotional regulation within relationships. Many conflicts arise not from disagreement, but from emotional tone. Words spoken in anger, defensiveness, or frustration carry emotional weight that often overshadows content. Emotional control involves regulating tone and timing as much as message. Calm communication increases the likelihood of understanding and resolution. Listening is equally important. Emotional reactions escalate when individuals feel unheard or misunderstood. Effective listening requires setting aside immediate emotional responses to fully understand the other person's perspective. This does not require agreement. It requires presence. Emotional control enhances listening by reducing the urge to defend or interrupt. One of the most common emotional challenges in relationships is personalization. Partners often interpret behaviors as intentional or reflective of emotional intent. Silence becomes rejection. Disagreement becomes disrespect. Emotional mastery involves questioning these interpretations rather than accepting them automatically. This reduces unnecessary emotional pain and conflict. Boundaries are essential for emotional stability in relationships. Without boundaries, individuals may absorb others' emotions or feel responsible for their moods. This leads to emotional exhaustion and resentment. Healthy boundaries clarify emotional responsibility. Each person is responsible for managing their own emotional responses. Boundaries protect connection rather than weaken it. Conflict is unavoidable in close relationships. Emotional control does not eliminate conflict, but it determines how conflict is handled. Reacting impulsively during conflict often causes lasting damage. Emotional discipline involves slowing down, focusing on the issue rather than personal attack, and seeking resolution rather than victory. Constructive conflict strengthens relationships. Another important aspect of emotional control in relationships is emotional timing. Addressing sensitive issues when emotions are high reduces clarity and increases defensiveness. Choosing appropriate moments for discussion improves outcomes. Delayed conversation is not avoidance when it is intentional and respectful. Timing is a form of emotional intelligence. Emotional dependency increases emotional volatility. When emotional stability depends heavily on another person's behavior or approval, reactions become exaggerated. Independence and connection are not opposites. They are complementary. Trust plays a significant role in emotional regulation. Lack of trust amplifies emotional reactions such as jealousy, suspicion, and fear. Trust does not require certainty. It requires willingness to tolerate uncertainty without constant emotional reaction. Emotional control supports trust by reducing impulsive responses driven by insecurity. Forgiveness is another critical element in relational emotional control. Holding on to past grievances intensifies present emotional reactions. Forgiveness does not erase memory or accountability. It releases emotional attachment to past hurt. This release restores emotional flexibility and prevents old emotions from dominating new interactions. Emotional expression in relationships must balance honesty and restraint. Suppressing emotions leads to distance and resentment. Unfiltered expression leads to conflict and instability. Emotional mastery involves expressing emotions clearly without aggression or blame. Using calm language preserves connection while addressing concerns. Self-awareness enhances relational emotional control. Recognizing personal emotional patterns allows individuals to take responsibility for their reactions. This responsibility reduces blame and defensiveness. Emotional growth within relationships requires willingness to examine one's own role in emotional dynamics. Empathy is strengthened through emotional regulation. When emotional reactions are controlled, individuals are better able to understand others' feelings and perspectives. Empathy does not require absorbing others' emotions. It requires recognizing them without losing balance. Emotional control enhances compassion without sacrificing stability. Emotional control also supports respect. Respect is damaged when emotions override boundaries or dignity. Calm, measured responses communicate self-respect and respect for others. This mutual respect forms the foundation of healthy relationships. Jealousy is a common emotional challenge in relationships. It arises from fear of loss or inadequacy. When unmanaged, jealousy leads to controlling behavior and emotional conflict. This approach preserves trust and autonomy. Attachment styles influence emotional reactions in relationships. Individuals with anxious attachment may react strongly to perceived distance, while those with avoidant tendencies may withdraw emotionally. Understanding these patterns increases compassion and reduces misinterpretation. Emotional control involves responding thoughtfully rather than reacting based on attachment-driven impulses. Relationships also involve emotional repair. Mistakes and misunderstandings are inevitable. Emotional mastery includes the ability to acknowledge errors, apologize sincerely, and move forward without prolonged emotional punishment. Repair restores trust and strengthens connection. Another key aspect is emotional presence. Being emotionally present means giving attention without distraction or emotional preoccupation. Presence reduces misunderstanding and strengthens emotional bonds. Emotional control enhances presence by reducing internal noise. In long-term relationships, emotional patterns become established. Without conscious effort, These patterns can lead to recurring conflict. Emotional mastery involves recognizing and adjusting these patterns over time. Change requires patience and consistent effort from both sides. Emotional control in relationships also extends to endings and transitions. Loss, separation, and change evoke strong emotions. Managing these transitions with dignity and self-respect preserves emotional well-being. Emotional mastery does not eliminate pain, but it prevents unnecessary suffering. Ultimately, emotional control in relationships allows connection without chaos. It supports intimacy without emotional dependency and honesty without harm. Relationships become sources of growth rather than instability when emotional regulation is practiced consistently. This chapter demonstrates that emotional mastery enhances relationships rather than restricting them. It allows individuals to engage deeply while maintaining inner balance. The next chapter will explore emotional control in professional life and leadership, where emotional discipline directly influences credibility, performance, and long-term success. Unlike personal settings, workplaces require individuals to manage emotions while maintaining productivity, credibility, and cooperation. Decisions often have consequences beyond the individual, and emotional reactions can influence teams, outcomes, and reputations. Emotional mastery in professional life is not optional. It is a defining factor of effectiveness, leadership, and long-term success. Emotions at work are often underestimated. Many assume professionalism requires emotional neutrality. In reality, emotions are always present, shaping motivation, communication, and judgment. The difference lies in how emotions are managed. Emotionally uncontrolled environments breed conflict, inefficiency, and mistrust. Emotionally regulated environments promote clarity, stability, and performance. Pressure is a central feature of professional life. Deadlines, expectations, competition, and accountability activate emotional responses such as anxiety, frustration, and self-doubt. Without regulation, these emotions impair focus and decision-making. Emotional control allows pressure to be converted into structured effort rather than chaotic stress. This conversion distinguishes high performers from reactive ones. One of the most critical professional emotional skills is response control. Workplace situations often provoke immediate emotional reactions, such as criticism, disagreement, or perceived disrespect. Responding impulsively damages credibility and escalates conflict. Emotional discipline involves pausing, assessing context, and responding intentionally. This restraint communicates confidence and competence. Feedback is a common emotional trigger. Even constructive feedback can evoke defensiveness or insecurity. Emotional mastery involves separating feedback from identity. Feedback reflects behavior or performance, not personal worth. When feedback is received calmly and evaluated objectively, it becomes a tool for growth rather than a source of emotional distress. Authority and hierarchy also influence emotional reactions. Power dynamics can evoke fear, resentment, or overconfidence. Respecting authority without submission and exercising authority without arrogance reflect emotional maturity. Balanced emotional responses strengthen professional relationships. Leadership amplifies the importance of emotional regulation. Leaders influence not only outcomes, but emotional climates. A leader's emotional reactions set the tone for teams. Emotional volatility creates instability and fear. Emotional stability creates trust and confidence. Leadership requires the ability to remain composed under pressure and decisive amid uncertainty. Emotionally controlled leaders do not suppress emotion. They express it appropriately. They acknowledge challenges without panic, address conflict without aggression, and demonstrate concern without losing authority. This balance fosters psychological safety and engagement. Teams perform better when emotional signals from leadership are consistent and reliable. Decision-making is highly sensitive to emotional state. Stress narrows attention and increases risk aversion or impulsivity. Anger biases judgment toward confrontation. Anxiety promotes overanalysis and hesitation. Emotional mastery allows decisions to be guided by data, values, and long-term perspective rather than temporary emotional states. Conflict resolution is another area where emotional control is essential. Professional disagreements are inevitable. Emotional reactions, such as defensiveness or blame, intensify conflict and hinder resolution. Emotional discipline involves focusing on issues rather than personalities. Calm engagement reduces escalation and promotes constructive outcomes. Reputation in professional life is shaped not only by competence, but by emotional conduct. How individuals handle stress, disagreement, and failure is observed closely. Emotional reactions leave lasting impressions. Controlled responses build respect. Repeated emotional outbursts erode trust and credibility, regardless of technical skill. Emotional control also affects adaptability. Change is a constant in professional environments. Resistance to change often manifests as frustration or fear. Emotional mastery allows individuals to process uncertainty without paralysis. Adaptable professionals acknowledge discomfort while remaining flexible and solution-focused. Workplace relationships require emotional intelligence. Collaboration involves navigating different personalities, communication styles, and expectations. Emotional regulation reduces misunderstandings and promotes cooperation. Recognizing emotional cues without reacting impulsively enhances teamwork and reduces friction. Another important aspect of professional emotional control is managing ego. Ego-driven reactions often emerge in competitive environments. Defensiveness, need for recognition, and fear of appearing weak undermine collaboration and learning. Emotional mastery involves grounding self-worth internally rather than through comparison or validation. Stress management is inseparable from emotional regulation. Chronic stress erodes emotional resilience, leading to burnout and reactivity. Emotional mastery includes recognizing early signs of overload and taking corrective action. Rest, boundaries, and recovery are not weaknesses. They are strategic investments in performance and stability. Professional setbacks are inevitable. Mistakes, failures, and rejection evoke strong emotions. Emotional control determines recovery. Individuals who ruminate emotionally remain stuck. Those who regulate emotions analyze, adapt, and move forward. Ethical judgment is also influenced by emotional state. Fear, anger, or desire for approval can compromise integrity. Emotional mastery supports ethical consistency by reducing impulsive decision-making under pressure. Calm judgment aligns actions with values even in challenging circumstances. Emotional control enhances communication effectiveness. Clear, calm communication reduces misunderstanding and conflict. Emotional discipline allows difficult messages to be delivered respectfully and received openly. This clarity improves outcomes and strengthens professional relationships. In leadership development, emotional control is often the differentiating factor. Technical skills can be learned, but emotional regulation determines sustainability. Leaders who cannot manage emotions struggle to maintain trust and direction. Emotional mastery enables leaders to navigate complexity with composure. Professional success is not achieved through emotional suppression, but through emotional integration. Recognizing emotions, regulating responses, and aligning behavior with purpose creates consistency. This consistency builds confidence in others and in oneself. Ultimately, emotional control in professional life creates stability in an unstable environment. It allows individuals to perform under pressure, lead with integrity, and adapt with clarity. Emotional mastery transforms work from a source of chronic stress into an arena for disciplined growth.